Okay, so let's get into this. We're looking at a recent piece from The Guardian today. It's about that second round of talks, between Ukraine and Russia. And our goal here really is to just unpack what the article says was agreed and maybe more importantly what wasn't, based just on this one source. Honestly, after that first round, I was pretty curious if anything concrete could actually come out of these meetings right now.
Yeah, and it's worth remembering that just having direct talks happen at all during an active conflict.
Yeah.
Well, that itself is significant in a way.
Sure.
Expectations might be, tempered, but sometimes you do see these specific, maybe smaller agreements emerge, even if the big issues don't budge. This Guardian report seems to point right at that.
Right. Okay, so let's dive in. What The Guardian really flagged as the main result from the second round, there was something solid reported, something they actually managed to agree on.
Yes, exactly. That's what the article highlights.
Hmm.
Apparently, a pretty significant agreement was reached specifically about a prisoner of war exchange, a POW deal.
Ah,
So, yeah, a very specific sort of tangible outcome from this session, according to the report.
a POW deal.
Yeah.
Okay, so one concrete thing, maybe a humanitarian step, but the article puts that right next to something major that was not agreed upon.
Yeah.
What was the big thing missing?
That's the contrast they draw, yeah. The source is quite clear that even with that POW agreement, there was no breakthrough on a wider ceasefire.
No ceasefire.
No. The whole issue of stopping the broader fighting, halting hostilities across the board, that was left unresolved in these particular talks, based on this reporting.
Wow. Okay, so a deal on something as complex, really, as prisoner exchanges is possible.
hmm
But I guess the more fundamental thing of just stopping the shooting, that wasn't achieved. That juxtaposition is, well, it's pretty stark, isn't it?
It is stark. And what you can maybe read into that, but based purely on how The Guardian presents it, is a pattern you sometimes see.
Right.
Specific, maybe more contained issues, especially ones like prisoner exchanges that have a clear humanitarian side sometimes, sometimes they can find a path forward.
Even when the bigger stuff is deadlocked.
Exactly. Even when those huge underlying political and military disagreements that are, driving the whole conflict remain totally stuck. The article focusing on these two things, deal here, no deal there, kind of underlines that dynamic.
Yeah.
Limited progress on one track while the main track is blocked.
Okay, that makes sense. So, bringing it back to you listening, why does understanding this specific mix success on POWs, failure on a ceasefire, why does that matter for how you understand what's going on?
Well, I think it gives you a more granular picture of how these negotiations might actually work on the ground. It shows it's not always, all or nothing.
Right.
Progress, when it happens, might be quite specific, maybe focused on these defined humanitarian or procedural things like the POW deal mentioned here.
Okay.
But at the same time, the lack of a ceasefire agreement really highlights where the massive hurdles still are. It suggests, based on this source, just how incredibly difficult it is to tackle the root causes right now.
So it helps you see where future talks might struggle, or maybe where they could potentially find tiny openings.
Precisely. It kind of sets realistic expectations, perhaps.
Wow.
It shows that some doors might creak open for very specific agreements.
Well, the main ones are still bolted shut.
Exactly. And looking at what kind of deal is possible versus what isn't, that contrast itself can be quite revealing about the state of play.
Okay. So maybe a final thought for you to consider then, building right off what this Guardian article reported. If a deal could be made on something as complex and sensitive as prisoner exchanges, but not on a general ceasefire, what does that particular combination, that specific mix of success and failure from this round, what might that suggest about the immediate path forward, according to this source? Something to chew on.